colon surgery, you know, people get infections or they get readmitted or they suffer complications. And we too often listed those as they're inevitable. Oh, there's nothing we can do about it. And I started to question whether we might indeed be able to make a difference in that.
But at that time you were a junior doctor, right?
Right, it was very scary.
So your seniors, how did they react to this? Did they say, okay, Peter, go ahead, do something, or did they ask you just be quiet?
No, a couple of lessons helped because it's pretty risky questioning senior doctors. And the first was always make sure that the focus is on the patient and not me. You know, that it was about doing what's right for patients. This wasn't about me. Second, it was to be humble enough to realize it and be transparent about my own mistakes and shortcomings and how I was one of those doctors. And lastly, and perhaps most important, was what I would say seeking to understand and not judge. You know, too often when doctors or nurses resist patient safety efforts, we judge them as they're, you know, obstructionist and they don't want to participate. And what I learned is that most times there's a good reason why they're pushing back. Right? They may not express it in an emotionally intelligent way. In other words, at least in the U.S., they may scream and have a tantrum, but underneath it, there may be some unanticipated consequences. There may be some real risk to patients that I hadn't thought of. There may be some real biologic reasons why complications happen. So when someone resists it, I always seek to understand and speak to them and say, well, you know, John, help me understand why you don't seem to be supporting this, and I acknowledge their commitment to their patients. I know you care deeply about your patients, but this program seems to work. Could you explain to me why?
I think the end most of them come along with it.
Yeah.
But you do have an occasional disruptive behavior.
You sure do, yeah. Yeah, one of the metaphors that I use, John, and it's been really helpful, is to be unwavering in the hill we're going to climb, but be humble enough to invite everybody to help me climb it, right? And it's a tough balance. The other thing that we learned in this work, John, and I didn't have time to go into it in my speech, was whenever you lead these efforts, you can think of the work as falling into two types of work. There's one type that I would call technical work, and that's the science, right? It's what do we know about how to prevent infections, what should go on the checklist, how to measure it. And then the other part of the work is what we'll call adaptive. And it's the part that there is no science. It's about changing culture and getting people's hearts engaged in it and overcoming resistance. And if you look at where we spend our efforts, we spend 90% of our time on the technical work, which it needs to be right, but 90% of projects fail for the adaptive work. We don't get people bought in, and we don't train doctors how to get people motivated and excited behind a project, or how to overcome resistance. And you know, just that simple idea of when doctors push back, you know, being confident to say, we're going to eliminate these infections, right? And I hope you help me do it. I need you to help me do it. But just because you're the senior surgeon, you don't want to do it, isn't stopping me from doing it. You know, we have an obligation to do this. And finding that right tension is often challenging.
Well, obviously, you were able to convince a lot of people to go ahead with you. And you've been very committed to this, as what we quite often refer to as a champion. Is it possible to do these kinds of projects without having a champion?
Yeah, no, I think these kinds of projects, like any change effort, always needs a champion who is passionate, who creates a common vision, and could inspire other people to come along. You know, if you look at all of history, great leaders, you know, whether it's from Alexander the Great to Winston Churchill, have four attributes, and I think healthcare needs to remember this, that these leaders, the great leaders who inspire change, they have a bedrock of values, right? And in our case, it's the patient. There's very strong values. They have a clear moral compass. I'm not trying to get rich off of this or trying to get some personal credit. The moral compass is what's right. They create a compelling vision, and they can inspire others to align towards that vision, right? And I think your point of having a change agent, the only way we're going to make progress in safety is if we have those same things, right? That there's clear values for the patient, there's a moral compass that guides us, that we have a vision of reducing harm in orthopedics or general surgery or primary care, and we get people inspired. Now, the way we get people inspired is to bring them into the work, to be humble enough to say, we need your wisdom. You know how to do this better than I do. Because, the reality is, every one of our hospitals or healthcare systems are so different that I know how to practice medicine at Johns Hopkins, but that's it. I can't really advise how you should practice medicine. I could give you ideas about what worked, but that requires your local leadership to drive.
Yes, but still, is a project like this, the one that we were talking about this morning, for instance, will that be sustainable when the champion disappears? Because in the end, he'll probably, or she will retire or go to another hospital or something. Yeah. Can you get it embedded in the sort of system of the work without anyone having to be so committed?
Yeah, and I think that's what we've done in our Michigan work. If you looked about it, the project that I worked with them was only 2 years. But I showed you results stayed low for 4 years now. And what happened was local doctors now took over the program, and once they got excited about how this could be science-based, that it could be measurement, that it could really make a difference, local doctors are now keeping it going. And so there's different champions, there's always going to be a leader, but it rotates and it changes. But what's exciting is that they now have the skills and, more importantly, the mental model or the attitudes to reduce harm, and are developing their own programs. So they're doing one on sepsis and one on pneumonia. So I think champions are important, but it could evolve over time. So
it doesn't have to be the same person as a champion. That would change all the time. Now, one of the things that you've been working with is with checklists. You take the guidelines that can be extremely long and difficult to read, and boil them down to a checklist with 5 or 6 points. Now, the checklist actually makes the staff able to follow the guidelines. And you've seen an increase of adherence to the guidelines. Now, what will happen to medicine if everyone just follows guidelines and checklists? Couldn't doctors be replaced by really anyone? It's just Pronovost. What will happen to creativity? What will happen to new developments in medicine?
And that, I think, is perhaps the most important aspect for medicine to understand. And because we have very incomplete knowledge, and science needs to always innovate and advance. And so how do we reconcile that with standardization? And at least the way I think about this is that I try to separate what I call mindless variation from mindful variation. So mindless variation is variation which exists in most of medicine because I'm powerful, because I'm the senior doctor and I want to do it my way and that's the way I've always done it, but there's no science or there's no theory behind it. It's just I'm the doctor, I'm the decision maker, this is how I want to do it. That needs to go away. Mindful variation is variation when I have a hunch or an idea that hey, I'm doing this because I think these types of patients are different, or this setting is different. But with that, I have an obligation to study it, which is why I think the idea of being a learning organization is so key, because once you standardize practice, you have an instant opportunity to learn, because you've taken all the background variation out. So now I can see, okay, if I tweak this one way versus another, are my outcomes better? The other point about variation, John, And it's a hard time for scientists to understand